Hello everyone and welcome back to The Movie Maker. As you've seen, I finished the first series of videos related to the great history of cinema. I didn't talk about the history of cinema, but I thought it appropriate to create 5 introductory videos to explain what the art of film is. Because obviously cinema is not a very simple art form without taking anything away from the other arts. Cinema is not a painter with canvas and colors. Cinema is made by a multitude of people who work together. So it's a very complex art, which is why I thought it really necessary to first explain how cinema is made, then to venture into the history of cinema. Meanwhile, I decided to make this video, which is a spin-off video that touches an important aspect of cinematography, that is music, what's technically called filmic musical dramaturgy. I've also put together a little gift for all of you, essentially a playlist of all the music pieces significant through the 20th century and beyond, basically to the present day, from the authors most important in the history of film music. I'll explain at the end of the video how to download and find this playlist. I'll naturally put the link under the YouTube video. And it's a playlist of which, honestly, I'm very proud because it took many days to put it together. And I believe I've included everything that's fundamental and important in the history of film music, all the composers. But naturally, I'm only talking about symphonic music. We already said in the previous video, there are 2 types of musical contributions to a film, the score and the soundtrack. We Italians get confused when talking about the soundtrack because the soundtrack, as I mentioned before, is everything. It's music, the actors' dialogues, effects. While Anglos don't face this issue because they define symphonic music as the score, so the one with 50 elements from an orchestra, I'm talking about this kind of music, and I will talk about this kind of music now, and the soundtrack, which is instead a musical score composed of the performed form of songs, basically. Alright? So I've put together this massive playlist. It's turned into a playlist of over 10 hours that I hope you like. And then let me also know in the comments below the video if, in your opinion, I have left out something, I forgot to talk about something fundamental, or to insert something fundamental in this very long playlist that I think is made up of about 170, 200 songs, something like that. Let's go in order. What happens in the history of cinema at a musical level? It's appropriate. That is, it's important to note, we often think that with the advent of sound in 1927 with this film called The Jet Singer, music also came to films. In reality, it's not like that because the music, even if before it was not possible to record it on the film's reel, it was still possible to play it live. It's a bit like what happens today when we have some special performances. For example, recently there was Harry Potter with the live orchestra, The Lord of the Rings with the live orchestra. They're quite an event nowadays, but once upon a time in the 1910s, 1920s, it was a common practice because in the famous Parisian cafes, not only there, they'd project the silent film with live music. But orchestra could be an overstatement, since these were small cafes, so there wasn't a full-fledged orchestra. There was typically a pianist, and in the more prominent cafes, perhaps someone with a violin or a brass instrument, for example. It was quite rare to have a full orchestra, naturally. This also happened in the first significant cinema in Italy, which opened in 1901 in Florence and was approximately where the bookshop in Piazza della Repubblica is now, for instance. I mean, this was just it. Someone would play while the silent film was showing, okay? Now, how did this happen? Obviously, films changed and changed often, so those who played under the various scenes of the films didn't always have an idea of what film was coming up and what they were supposed to play to because I had no idea which film would arrive and what it was supposed to play on because they didn't see the films, they didn't have the time at all, so the pianist relied on a series of sheets that are called cue sheets and that were guides, a kind of canvas for music for films, depending on the type of scene that the composer. No, because the pianist, the player, had to adapt his music somewhat like a jazz musician of the time would have done and not improvise, because it would have been really impossible. But through these cue sheets to create live, a certain type of music adaptable to the type of scene. So if there was a love scene, the cue sheet had a specific score suitable for a love scene. If there was a scene that had to make you scared, a music suitable for creating tension and so on. And this was the process that was used until the mid-20s, roughly until the advent of sound. Then what happens? Especially in American Hollywood studios, this happens. Sound arrives, the world gets overturned by the arrival of this new technology that was unthinkable at the time. Even many actors commit suicide at the advent of sound because they were superb actors in silent cinema, but they didn't know how to talk at all. They didn't know how to act at all. If you want to see an interesting movie that speaks precisely about this moment in the history of cinema, I recommend Singing in the Rain by Stanley Dunn, which in addition to being one of the most important musicals in the history of film music, tells precisely this moment in the history of cinema. So what happens from that moment onwards? Thinking about composing specific music for a film, the composers, the arrangers of the cultural composers' music created for cinema, let's say, were seen as workers. For a composer, working for the cinema was seen as vulgar, truly vulgar. Of course, some of the greats of the 20th century, including the immense and unattainable Sergei Prokofiev, who composed the music for Alexander Nevsky and Ivan the Terrible for the Russian director Sergei Eisenstein, already mentioned in previous videos, didn't think this way at all. Instead, they saw it as a great compositional opportunity, composing to serve the images of a film. And so did Leonard Bernstein, for example, who composed the film music for On the Town in 1949, if I'm not mistaken, and later one of the most important musicals in cinema history, West Side Story, in the 1960s. So you can imagine, of course, not everyone thought this way, fortunately. On the contrary, film music was a great opportunity for what we call classical music, symphonic style, to emerge even more and reach everyone's ears. We can truly say this. It's a fundamental part of 20th century music without a doubt. The first real film music relationship we have in history dates back to the mid-1910s, so during the early silent era, so the soundtrack was not recorded, but was played live, but was specifically created for two films specifically. One is an Italian film, Cabiria, from 1914, and the other is the previously mentioned Birth of a Nation by David Ward Griffith, who is considered the father of cinematography. Griffith worked with this music author named Carl Braille, who crafted a score specifically for Birth of a Nation mixed with other pre-existing scores. This was the first true relationship between a director and a composer that they created together. Who together thought about how to construct the music for the film. The music for the film specifically can also be accompaniment music or commentary music. What's the difference between these two types of music? A big difference. The accompaniment music is limited to accompanying the images, a bit like the pianist who plays live under the screen in the era before the advent of sound, right? So it accompanies the images so that the images are somehow enhanced, let's say, by the musical element. But it's a criticism. The accompaniment music is a bit like when, I don't know, we video makers, YouTubers, put a very low music even under the videos while we make travel videos perhaps, or while we explain something, which specifically I'm not doing right now, for example. There's no accompaniment music, there's only my voice. So there's only the dialogue, let's say the monologue in this case. There's another type of music, that's commentary music. What does commentary music do? It can confirm what the pictures say or say something different. Let me give you an example. If we have commentary music, it's interpretive music. Naturally, it's music that interprets images. I can have a quiet scene, a landscape, a normal dialogue between people at a table, and have music that accompanies this situation in a way that absolutely confirms the situation. On the other hand, I can have commentary music that tells me something different. For example, how do you create a tense scene? Normally, a tense scene comes quite suddenly, but it's announced by the music. So I have my normal scene with people having a dialogue at a table. At some point, the music becomes dissonant with respect to the scene. That is, I start to hear tense music. Fear, which gives me the feeling that something is about to happen. This is not background music, but rather a commentary, specifically a dissonant commentary in relation to the scene. So think about how much music can, let's say, support the image, whatever it may be, but in completely different ways. There's another unique element, quite amusing, beyond the music of accompaniment and commentary, which was created by Walt Disney in his cartoons, and it's referred to, not coincidentally, as Mickey Mousing, taken from the name, of course, Mickey Mouse. And it's that music that goes to emphasize, to highlight, almost as if to replace sound effects. It's much simpler to show an example than to actually explain it. A quite amusing example, of course, but it wasn't used exclusively in cartoons. It was also used, for example, in Some Like It Hot by Billy Wilder, in the elevator scene. One more thing. A girl. Do you think it's me, Mr. Regardless, Mickey Mousing is indeed a musical element that accompanies, but it also replaces or enhances a noise, therefore a sound effect.